Quick question. What generation are you? If you were born somewhere between 1993 and 1999, you've probably noticed this question doesn't have a clean answer anymore. Tell a millennial your birth year and they'll say you're basically Gen Z. Tell a Gen Z kid and they'll say you're basically a millennial. Congratulations, you've been demoted and promoted in the same conversation, and nobody asked you what you think. This isn't just internet arguing for the sake of it. You are, technically, a Zillennial, a name that sounds like it was generated by a marketing team running out of ideas, but it points at something real. You were born right on the seam between two completely different ways of growing up, and that seam runs straight through your actual psychology, not just your birth certificate. Here's what that seam looks like in practice. You remember a childhood with no smartphones in it. Landlines, dial-up internet that took actual minutes to load a single image. A TV schedule you had to plan your evening around because there was no pausing live television. Then, right around the time your brain was hitting its most socially sensitive, most identity-forming years, the entire world flipped a switch. Smartphones showed up. Social media stopped being a website you checked and became the place you actually lived. You didn't get a slow introduction to any of this. You got the analog version of childhood and the digital version of adolescence back to back, with basically no transition period in between. That's not a small detail, that's the whole story. Psychologists who study identity formation generally agree that the teenage years are when people are most actively figuring out who they are, testing out versions of themselves, watching how the world reacts. Most generations get to do that experimenting inside one consistent set of rules. You did it while the rules themselves were being rewritten in real time. You weren't just becoming a teenager, you were becoming a teenager during a live beta test for how human beings should use the internet. And the people running that beta test had absolutely no idea what they were doing either. So when people online argue about whether 1996 counts as millennial or Gen Z, that's not just nostalgia bait, even if it dresses itself up that way. It's actually pointing at something psychologically real. An entire group of people whose foundational years got split right down the middle, and who've spent the years since trying to figure out which half of that split they're supposed to identify with. Let's get specific, because you're in between two generations only explains so much. There are a few concrete fault lines running through your life that actually explain why this feels less like a fun internet personality quiz and more like genuine disorientation. Start with timing, the unglamorous kind. A lot of you hit the job market right as the 2008 financial crisis was still wrecking the economy, or right in its long, miserable hangover. You did everything you were told to do. Good grades, a degree, maybe two, and the job market basically shrugged at you. Meanwhile, older millennials had a few extra years to get established before everything collapsed, and Gen Z came up watching this exact disaster happen to you, which meant they adjusted their entire life plan before they even graduated high school. You got none of that warning. You walked straight into it. Then there's the social comparison problem, and this one's sneakier. You were old enough to remember a version of yourself that existed before social media, a version that wasn't being constantly measured, photographed, ranked, and compared. But you were also young enough that by the time you hit your most self-conscious teenage years, Facebook, then Instagram, were already fully part of daily life. So unlike older millennials who got to finish most of their identity development before the comparison machine showed up, and unlike Gen Z who never knew anything else, you got to experience both. You know exactly what it felt like to not be performing for an audience, and you know exactly what it felt like when that stopped being optional. That contrast doesn't just disappear, it sits there as a kind of background hum, a constant low-grade awareness that you're being watched and measured in a way earlier versions of yourself never had to deal with. Even your pop culture references won't fully line up with either group, which sounds trivial until you realize how much identity is built out of shared references. Mention a show from your childhood and millennials nod along while Gen Z stares blankly. Mention something from your college years and it's the exact reverse. You end up fluent in two cultural languages, but never quite a native speaker of either. Always doing a little bit of translating just to have a normal conversation about what you grew up watching. There's also a quieter version of this happening in how you actually communicate, day to day. You text like a millennial, which apparently means full sentences, proper punctuation, the occasional period at the end of a message that Gen Z reads as borderline hostile. Meanwhile, you're also fluent in the internet's faster, weirder, more ironic dialect, the one built entirely out of memes and shifting slang that changes meaning every few months. You can move between both registers depending on who you're talking to, which sounds like a useful skill until you notice you're essentially code switching just to text your own coworkers, depending on which side of the generational line they happen to fall on. And underneath all of this sits a quieter discomfort, the fact that you were essentially a test group. The platforms, the algorithms, the entire attention economy, none of it was built with any data on what this would do to a developing brain, because nobody had been through it yet. Older generations got to watch all this unfold from a safe distance, already formed, already stable. Younger ones at least got platforms that had a few years of trial and error baked into the design. You got the rawest, least refined version of all of it, right when you were most vulnerable to it shaping who you'd become. Nobody decided this on purpose. It's just what happens when you're born exactly where the timeline bends. So is all of this just a glorified excuse to feel sorry for yourself on the internet? Not really, and here's the more useful way to think about it. Being caught between two generations isn't only a disadvantage, even though it definitely doesn't feel that way at 2 a.m., scrolling through people 10 years younger than you who somehow already own property. The same in-between position that makes you hard to categorize also makes you genuinely adaptable. In a way, neither group on either side of you really had to be. You know how to function without constant connectivity, because you remember when that was just normal life. You also know how to function fully online, because you came of age right as that became unavoidable. You're not stuck choosing one operating system, you're fluent in both, which is a strange kind of advantage nobody designed on purpose. There's also something worth saying about the discomfort itself. Feeling like you don't fully belong to either generational box isn't a personal failure or a sign that something's wrong with you specifically, it's a pretty well-documented pattern. People born on the edges of generational categories consistently report this same sense of not quite fitting the label, mostly because the labels themselves are blunt tools built for marketing and sociology, not for the actual messy specifics of any one person's life. You were never going to fit neatly into a box that was invented after the fact to describe a 20-year span of different lives, different cities, different households. The box was always going to be too small. That's not about you. What probably matters more than the label is the actual shared experience underneath it, the very specific, very real thing of growing up analog and finishing growing up digital, with no instructions and no older generation who'd already been through the exact same transition to ask for advice. That's not nothing. That's a genuinely unique developmental experience, and it makes sense that it left a mark. So next time someone tells you that you're basically Gen Z or basically a millennial, you don't actually have to pick a side. You were there for the hinge point. You watched the world change shape in real time, right as you were changing shape yourself, and you came out the other side fluent in two completely different versions of being a person. That's a strange thing to carry around. It's also, in its own slightly chaotic way, kind of the whole point.